Some stories in the Bible have hidden messages. Of course, it's common for people to say that a story in the Bible has a hidden meaning, but usually these allegorical interpretations are not convincing. However, sometimes stories in the Bible do have hidden messages, and occasionally they come out and say they have a hidden message, but they don't tell you what the message is. They expect the reader to decipher it. This is the case in the story in which Jesus miraculously feeds a crowd with just a few loaves and fish. While most readers might read this story and not realize there is deeper significance, Jesus actually tells his disciples that there is a hidden meaning behind the event. After the miraculous feeding, Jesus is with his disciples in a boat, and he asks them how many baskets of food were left over. When they tell him the number of leftover baskets, Jesus then asks, "Do you not yet understand?" It seems Jesus is implying that there is something significant about the specific number of baskets, but he never says what that is. Fortunately, Mark has left clues in his gospel to help his readers decipher what the deeper meaning of the story is. The weird thing about this story is that when you start to decipher it, you realize that it doesn't just have one layer of hidden meaning. It actually has two. Probably the first clue that something strange is going on is the fact that this event happens twice, in almost exactly the same way each time. The first time, Jesus feeds a crowd of 5,000 people, whereas the second time, he feeds 4,000. Surprisingly, there are a number of unique parallels between the way that both miraculous feedings play out. In both stories, the crowds have nothing to eat. Jesus feels compassion for them. Jesus asks how many loaves there are. Jesus tells the crowds to sit down. Jesus takes the food. He blesses the food, breaks it, and gives it to his disciples to serve. The crowd eats and is satisfied. The disciples pick up the leftovers, and the final number of leftover baskets is recorded. While it's certainly strange that such a similar event occurs twice in the Gospel of Mark, what's even more interesting is that there are important parallels between these feedings and the Last Supper. In both the miraculous feeding and the Last Supper, Jesus takes the food, blesses it, breaks it, gives it, and gives thanks for it. These 5 verbal parallels suggest that there is some kind of connection between the miraculous feedings and the Last Supper. It seems that the miraculous feeding foreshadows the Last Supper, in which Jesus relates the bread to his own body, which is a sacrifice for humanity. Therefore, when Jesus multiplies the loaves in the miraculous feeding, it represents Jesus' giving of his own body for the people, multiplying this sacrifice so that it can be applied to everyone. This is the first layer of hidden meaning behind the miraculous feeding. Of course, I am not the first person to notice the connection between the miraculous feeding and the Last Supper. Many readers have noticed this deeper meaning for thousands of years. However, the second, deeper layer of hidden meaning is much harder to decipher. After the 2 feedings, Jesus asks his disciples an important question. "When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Jesus stresses to his disciples that they should be paying attention to the little details in both versions of the miraculous feeding, specifically the number of leftover baskets. But what could be so important about the numbers 12 and 7? And how could these numbers unlock a deeper message hidden in the feedings? In order to understand the meaning behind these numbers, it's first necessary to take note of the one important difference between the 2 miraculous feedings. This difference is that the first feeding is to the Jews, whereas the second feeding is to the Gentiles. The first feeding in Mark is narrated in the middle of Jesus' activity in Jewish areas, which is normal for most of Jesus' activity in the Gospel of Mark. However, the second miraculous feeding occurs in the Decapolis, which is a Gentile area. The Gospel of Matthew is also clear that Jesus' activity in the Decapolis was directed toward Gentiles, since Matthew says that the crowds glorified the God of Israel, which shows that the crowd is made up of Gentiles who are used to glorifying other gods. A third clue that the first feeding is to Jews and the second feeding to Gentiles is the specific Greek words Mark uses to refer to the baskets. In the first feeding, Mark says that there were 12 baskets, with the Greek word for basket being kophanos, which was a distinctively Jewish form of basket, whereas in the second feeding, Mark says there were 7 baskets, using the Greek word spuridos, which was a more universal form of basket that would have been used by Gentiles as well. Therefore, by using different words for baskets, Mark makes it clear that the first miraculous feeding was specifically to Jews and the second one was specifically to Gentiles. Now that we know this, it is possible to use this information to decipher the significance behind the number of baskets. If the first feeding was specifically to Jews, then the 12 leftover baskets probably signify the 12 tribes of Israel. Many scholars have argued that the 12 baskets do in fact represent the 12 tribes of Israel. However, it is less clear what the number 7 would signify. In the feeding to the Gentiles, there were 7 baskets left over. If the 12 baskets represent the 12 tribes of Israel to indicate the totality of Israel, then it would seem likely that the 7 baskets would somehow indicate the totality of the Gentiles. In my opinion, one strong possibility is that the number 7 indicates the 7 nations of Canaan. The Old Testament talks about the 7 nations of Canaan, which are the nations that Joshua led the 12 tribes of Israel against when they were conquering the Promised Land. One reason I like identification of 7 with the 7 nations of Canaan is that it plays a similar role to the number 12 with the 12 tribes of Israel. Both numbers call the reader back to an important time in Israel's history where 12 signifies God's chosen people and 7 signifies the outsiders or enemies of God's people. But are there any other clues Mark uses to show that 7 represents the 7 nations of Canaan? Interestingly, it seems that Mark implants an interpretive key into his narrative that supports the idea of 7 being the 7 nations of Canaan. In between the 2 different miraculous feedings comes probably the most puzzling story in the entire Gospel of Mark. This is the story in which Jesus travels to the Gentile region of Tyre, where he encounters a mysterious Gentile woman that Mark describes as a Syrophoenician woman. The woman asks Jesus to cast a demon out from her daughter, but Jesus surprisingly turns her down, saying, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But the woman doesn't take no for an answer and replies, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." Jesus responds, "Because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." This story is confusing for 2 reasons. First, because Jesus initially refuses to help the woman's daughter, and second, because the woman apparently outwits Jesus, causing him to change his mind. But when you understand what this story is really about, both of these difficulties go away. There is a verbal connection between this story and the 2 miraculous feedings that come before and after it. When Jesus says it is first necessary to give bread to the children, aka Jews, this recalls the reader to the fact that Jesus did recently give bread to the Jews in the first miraculous feeding, which was a feeding to the Jews. When the Gentile woman says that even the dogs, aka Gentiles, eat crumbs from the bread under the table, Jesus grants her wish. Soon after, there is the second miraculous feeding in which Jesus does give bread to the Gentiles, aka the dogs. Therefore, when Jesus had said to the woman that it was first necessary for him to give bread to the children before he gives it to the dogs, this first condition has actually already been met. He has already given bread to the children or Jews in the first miraculous feeding. This is why Jesus ultimately grants the woman's request, because the condition for helping her had already been met. Another important clue comes from the word satisfy. Jesus had said to the woman, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Interestingly, after the first miraculous feeding, it says, "They all ate and were satisfied." Therefore, when Jesus says it is first necessary for the children to be satisfied, this has already happened in the first miraculous feeding, which was to the Jews. Then, soon after Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, the second miraculous feeding happens, and again it says, "And they ate and were satisfied." Shockingly, the Greek word for satisfied is only used in the story of the Syrophoenician woman and in the 2 miraculous feeding stories in Mark's Gospel. clearly connecting the feedings to the Syrophoenician woman. Therefore, the encounter with the Syrophoenician woman confirms the meaning of the two feedings, that the first one represents the giving of bread to the Jews and the second one represents the giving of bread to the Gentiles. But how does this demonstrate that the 7 leftover baskets symbolize the 7 nations of Canaan? The answer comes in the description of the Gentile woman as being a Syrophoenician. Phoenicians in this time considered themselves and referred to themselves as Canaanites. This is why the Gospel of Matthew does not call her a Syrophoenician woman, but simply a Canaanite woman. Therefore, when Mark talks about the Syrophoenician woman, he is basically describing her as a Canaanite, and that is how Mark's readers would have understood the description. But Mark actually introduces her by saying she was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by race. The term Greek was often used by Jews as a synonym for Gentile, such as in Romans 3:9. Mark is taking someone who is a Gentile and honing in on the fact that she is specifically a Canaanite. Mark thereby uses a Canaanite as a symbol for Gentiles in general. Therefore, it makes sense that just a couple stories later, Mark would also use the 7 nations of Canaan as a symbol for Gentiles as a whole. This is especially clear when one sees that the story of the Syrophoenician woman is closely connected to the 2 miraculous feedings. Therefore, in my opinion, the 12 leftover baskets of the first feeding represent the 12 tribes of Israel, meaning Jews, and the 7 leftover baskets from the second miraculous feeding represent the 7 nations of Canaan, symbolizing Gentiles as a whole. But now that we can see that these 2 miraculous feedings represent the giving of bread to the Jews and to the Gentiles, how does this connect to the deeper theological message of Mark's gospel? Well, if you recall, the miraculous feedings were not simply physical feedings that satisfied people's hunger. They are connected through a series of verbal parallels to the Last Supper, where Jesus says that the bread is his body, which he laid down as a sacrifice for their sins. Therefore, the bread represents Jesus' sacrifice and his offer of forgiveness and salvation. The 2 feedings show that salvation is being offered not only to the Jews, but to the Gentiles as well, which was a very bold statement to make in the early church. Paul captures this idea clearly in Romans 1:16 when he writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content.